Hey students, so I'm making this video to help lead you through thinking about what a theoretical question is, what that might be and what that means. Okay, so many of you have taken theory classes before or are in a theory class now, so you have some idea about what it means to ask a theoretical question. Some others in the class might not know or might not have taken a theory class before, so I'm just going to go over a really basic definition. What is a theoretical question? Well, a theoretical question is a question whose answer attempts to explain something. And usually, what we're trying to explain when we're asking questions is events, behaviors, relationships, which can be falsified. Okay, so this last part, the which can be falsified part, is a complement clause. And also, it's the part that's about the theory, right? So a theory isn't proven yet. We can take a look at the theory and we can say, nah, it doesn't work or it doesn't make sense. It can be falsified. It's, it's still up in the air. We're not quite sure if this is right or not. It's still at a theory status. Okay, so now that you know that, we can kind of forget about that and we can concentrate on this part. So it's a question whose answer attempts to explain something. Let's talk about what it attempts to explain. Events, and that means, things that are happening in this world or phenomena or things that seem to be occurring. Behaviors, that can be behaviors of people. But if it's hard science, it's going to be behaviors of, smaller things, organisms. For example, epidemiologists right now are trying to understand the behavior of the coronavirus. But social scientists usually try to understand the behavior of people. And relationships. So this can be relationships between people, between groups of people, between two people, or it can be relationships between constructs or concepts, or relationships between a concept and how a person deals with that concept, right? So any kind of relationship. It doesn't mean romantic relationships or friendships necessarily, but it might mean that. So we're just looking at what's going on in the world and asking questions about that. That's basically what a theoretical question is, because we want to understand what's going on in the world. So all of this question asking is based on constructs. So constructs are things that groups of people get together and agree about. So you may have heard that something like gender is a social construct. So gender is a thing that groups of people have gathered together and made up, right? And they've identified signifiers that signify one gender or the other, like dresses are for women and suits are for men, or pink is for women, or something like that. Right? Speaking in a high voice is for women and a low voice is for men. These are social constructs. So these are things that people came up with and agreed upon. Oftentimes, it's powerful people that come up with constructs that last. And something like gender is a construct that has lasted a very long time and continues to prevail. But not necessarily. Even small subordinate groups of people around the world, they come up with their own social constructs, things that they think help build and maintain their societies or their groups. So all of us live within these social constructs. We abide by them all the time, every day, and we rarely even think about them. And we do things and think about the world the ways that we were taught to since we were a kid. So one of the really cool things about the humanities is that we start to think about, well, what are these constructs that I just accept? And do I have to accept them? Is there evidence that I could live my life a different way, or that others could live their lives in different ways? That's a theoretical question right there. But you guys have to ask theoretical questions about linguistics. That doesn't mean that the question only has to deal with language, right? You're using language to answer much bigger, broader questions. So supposedly you did some of this already. Either you asked theoretical questions or talked about those implications in your presentation, but honestly, most of you did not do that, so you have a little bit of work to do. But some of you, many of you, did give feedback to your peers, and many of you asked theoretical questions. So let's just take a look at an example of some of those questions that you asked. Let's see, Razi for Rahel. Okay, so we're in group B. Sorry about my slow computer. We're going to go to Rahel's. Come on. And I'm going to open up Razi's feedback for him. And we're just going to take a look at how some of her insights about Rahel's presentation brought up some interesting questions or an interesting question. This means that it's interesting to me. It doesn't necessarily mean it's interesting to you. You get to choose your own question. It doesn't matter if I find almost anything interesting, so you don't have to worry about if I'm going to find it interesting or not. Okay, so here Razi says, I noticed the poet writes about what's not there rather than what is actually there by using not and nothing like blank a lot. Does it indicate anything about the style of poems in the postmodernism era? And does that pattern say anything about death, which is the main topic of the poem? Ooh, so exciting. Talking about death and what does it mean? Okay, so the interesting thing to me about that is that there's kind of two different questions here. I think that the sort of the philosophical question about death is not just the sort of basic question that we ask all the time is like, what is death? What does it mean? But we could start with something like, can we learn more about what is here in this world by describing what is not here in this world, right? So rather than trying to describe what's here to learn what's here or describe what's there to learn what's there, but can we use one thing or to describe the absence of another or vice versa, right? So Jack Gilbert decides to do this, or Razi thinks that he's doing this on purpose, talking about what's not there by using these negations. And there are a lot of negations in the poem. So she picked up on that as a pattern. She's thinking about how we can think about how death is the absence of what we know here, and that might be a way to talk about and explain either not what death is, but what we're left with, right? How we move, how we go on. Oh, which honestly, Jack Gilbert's book of these poems is a lot about that. So great question, Razi. And if Rahel's interested in this, he can take this a little further. This is just the starting point, right? So the first question that you come up with doesn't have to be the question that your paper is based on. As we know in the sciences, questions are iterative. That means that they go through a lot of different versions before you settle on one. So you can modify your questions over and over and over just by attempting to answer them, right? So you might try to answer a theoretical question, and then you realize, oh, this question should change a little bit. And then you try to answer that, and you realize, okay, it needs to change in this other way. That's really, really common for the sciences. Okay, let's go back. We're going to look at Razi's presentation, and we'll look at some of Noor's feedback for her. Where are you, Noor? There you are. Okay. All right, so this is really exciting because Razi talked about the word diverge in her presentation, and it made Noor think about that word, particularly the morphology of it. So Razi pointed out, and I think the word was diverged, Past tense? Shoot, now I don't remember. But I think so. So I thought maybe, it had three morphemes, the root and then a prefix and a suffix. Here, Noor just talks about it being two, so the die and the verge. Regardless of what's true, Noor thought that die maybe meant negative, but it actually means two. It's Greek, like we say diphthong, right? It's two diphthong, diphthong. It's two sounds making one sound. Or ditransitive for verbs means that it takes two things that comes after it. Or dialogue means talking between two people. So in this way, die means two, but Duer talks about verge as meaning edge. So diverge, I thought, doesn't necessarily mean there are two edges, but that there's one edge split into two. And I thought that was a pretty great thing to point out. Noor asks, did you consider the connection as being far away from the edge? But I thought since die means two, maybe the edge is split in half or split in two. So I said, in the context of the poem, can we consider the two paths being one edge split apart? And since the poem talks about passing on the paths, and there's that lexical ambiguity of if passing means death or if it means going by something, are we passing on the paths, or rather the split edges? So imagine just if there's already an edge that you're walking along, if that edge is split, it's going to be even more difficult to traverse, and it may be more dangerous. This is just what I'm thinking off the top of my head, but Razi can consider that. And it all stemmed from this linguistic analysis of diverge, right? It's a relationship between the morphological analysis of the die and the verge and the semantic analysis of what that could possibly mean, right? So that's taking two linguistic elements and looking at the relationship between those two elements, and then looking at what that could possibly mean in the poem, in the context of the poem, and then looking at the greater implications in life. How does that relate to or add to the conversations that we have, the philosophical conversations that we have about death, or about paths that we take in our lives? I get super excited about stuff like this, but I think that's a pretty exciting question, and I would love to write a paper on that. However, I don't have to write a paper, you guys do. Okay, let's take another look. Let's do group A. That is not what I meant to do. Okay, Jira, we're going to take a look at your questions for Barzi. I could tell Jira was thinking a lot about Barzi's poem, had lots of questions that came up, but didn't have enough space and time to write them all. That's always really encouraging. Okay, so Jira is talking about this sort of the waves of feminism. He starts out by asking, why did she focus on the outlook? I think he means like the outward appearance more than anything else. Can we consider this poem a feminist one? So Jira said, if yes, he's supposing, let's just pretend or consider that it's a feminist poem, wouldn't we expect more focus on the intellect of a woman or the behavior or actions of a woman rather than the appearance? I'm pretty sure that's what Jira means here. Can we say that this poem is a counter to those who do not consider Black women to be beautiful or be able to achieve beauty standards? Great question. Okay, so in the US, beauty standards are, one, criterioned by being white, sometimes blonde, having fair skin or tanned fair skin. It's very particular. And for the longest time, Black women just didn't fit into any of the standards. Black women's bodies are very different than white women's bodies. And so they were always outside of those standards. They were also not represented in media very often, and usually not positively in media. And remember that this poem, Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman, was written in the mid-70s, I think. So at that time, Black women really didn't fit into those beauty standards. So he asks, is this poem counter to people who didn't consider Black women to be beautiful? Is that what the poem is about? Is that why it focuses more on the appearance and not so much on the intellectual or the behavior? Okay, he says, personally, this is what I got out of it, and my answer is yes to that last question. And then he has another question also, is this third wave feminist poem, does she give us Madonna vibes? So if you, both Cher and Barzy likely know what that means. Maybe the rest of you don't. But this is a kind of feminism that inhabits the body more than anything else and makes it be part of the world. He says, for me, she really does so many questions. Great. So I have some questions that come from that, right? So if it is a feminist poem, if it's particularly third wave, if it's focusing on appearance, then I asked, are there any patterns that show that to be true? Jura's questions to be true. Maybe simply pointing to the phenom, the meaning of which is an unusually gifted person, as an appearance to the rest of the world. But this is a good place to start. So we started with his questions here. I sort of moved it on so that it was connected to something linguistic, and now it's time for Barzy, if she's interested, to take this question and develop it into a more specific theoretical question. I kind of did that here. Can a poem be an appearance or a dance comparable to other icons, an icon like Madonna? What particular language can do that? Or can language do that? And can any poem do that, or does it have to be particular? Does it have to use a vernacular? Lots of questions that come up, but Barzy can explore them. Hopefully, you guys are getting an idea of how you start with a few questions and you get more and more specific, right? You start to think more and more deeply about what those questions mean. Okay, let's see. Barzi's question for Rabar about persistence. Rabar, let's go to yours. I know this video is getting long. I wanted to give you guys as many examples as I could. You can stop anytime or you take breaks or whatever. Feedback. Okay. So this is about Rabar's presentation from Barzy. Down here, she says, I liked how you connected the extension of the first line with and the with the idea of persistence. That's something I have not thought about before. Okay, so she's not asking a question here. She's not doing a lot of work for Rabar. She says that she likes something that he already did. So Barzy isn't really doing anything here. She's not doing any work. She's just saying she liked the work that Rabar did. But there's a good theoretical question in there somewhere. Can syntax contribute to a theme of persistence? So, in my head, I'm thinking, obviously, yeah, that's all syntax is, right? Syntax is recursion, and recursion is a form of persistence, saying I can keep going and going and going. It will persist. So how can that be represented in the poem? Well, with coordinators. That's what we've learned from syntax. And I'm not quite sure how the would get roped into that, but it's a starting place for a theoretical question for Rabar. There might be some others that may be easier or more interesting to him. Okay, Ghazala. We're going to go back to group B. So Rahel asked a question for Ghazala. I think it was hard to ask for you guys to give feedback to Ghazala because she did a lot of interpreting and not so much linguistic analysis. So I can see that it was hard. Rahel he did some good attempts here to ask theoretical questions for everyone. Here he says, my theoretical question is, do linguistic analyses of poems help us to understand poems? Okay, so perhaps this is the best he could do, but it's too broad, right? It's not very specific, and it's also a yes or no question um, that we could answer pretty quickly, probably, and we could answer using anybody's poem. But I think that we can turn this into a theoretical question that is possibly more specific to Ghazala's poem and analysis. Okay, so I said over here to Rahel, it's a good start. We can do more in-depth thinking, try to find relationships between two or more specific things that come up in the research or the analysis that she did. Okay, not Rahel's fault. It's true that Ghazala did not do a lot of linguistic analysis. It was mostly interpretation, so it's hard to know what to ask questions about. But she did point out a few things. One of the things I noticed that she pointed out were the animal names in the poem. Something about the animal names is that they all use bilabials. I think, let's see, dove, oh, that's not bi though, owl, wolf, something else. But that's a pattern that I notice immediately. I made an immediate theoretical question based off of my wild imagination. And if you wanted to answer this question, you'd have to go back and investigate a little further. Does the pattern of naming a category of things that use the same phonetic placement reveal something about the authors or society in general's love, lust, affection, or obsession? So we can start from that question and we can go from there. Okay, so when we have love, when we have lust, when we have affection, when we have obsession about something, do we show that in patterns? Right? Do we naturally use alliteration? Do we naturally use the same placement in our mouths to name those things? We can say the same thing about, do we put them in the same place syntactically in the sentence? Does something about obsession or does something about love or something about affection make our brains think about them in terms of patterns, right? This is a kind of like a psycholinguistic question, or a question of neurology or something like that. We're not hard scientists, so we're not going to try and answer that part of it. We're only going to look for evidence. We're going to try and see, does this come up in some of the Old English patterns as well? Something that comes up in the Old English poems is family names. They're just obsessed with family and family relationships. And it does come across syntactically. Remember that they don't have the possessive apostrophe S. They always say like son of Igor or cousin of Skilth or something like that. And I think they're almost always placed in the same place syntactically. So this could be an interesting theoretical question for Ghazala to explore, just because she noticed a similar pattern in her poem that she was looking at. And that's pretty neat. Okay, I guess I'll stop there. I did see other examples that you guys gave each other of theoretical questions, but I don't want this video to go on for the rest of our lives. I also put up some theoretical questions here that are linguistic questions. These are just to get you started. They're not very specific. Why do we use language? What's its function? How do we create language? Okay, so very broad. You'd have to get more specific and grounded in something in your poem. Why should or shouldn't poems follow prescriptive grammars or grammatics? Is the fact that people generally follow patterns and rules of language a kind of prescription? So just the fact that we don't even think about it. We follow patterns and rules. Are we prescriptive by nature? What does nature even mean? Right? Great. Okay. These are broad theoretical questions. When poets put the subject and the object before a verb, what is the consequence? The question here is not theoretical, but the answer can be theoretical. That means that we can just answer it easily by looking at one of the poems, right? But answering that question of what is the consequence of doing this would be theoretical. We'd be theorizing about how that's meaningful to people's lives. Does Old English follow patterns of recursion that are infinite? Right? So we know that modern English does Old English. And then, of course, what does that mean for people or to their culture? Does language have to follow patterns in order to be language? Right? So is that a defining factor of language? And then what are the implications? What would that mean to us as humans? Can I use syntactical adjuncts and complements to better understand human relationships? So I think that this type of question is always really interesting. Like, what models of science can we look at and use to understand personal relationships? I find that to be pretty fascinating. Can syntax in Old English teach me about how the Anglo-Saxons thought? Right? So does the syntax reflect thought, or is it just vice versa? Do any of the phonological or morphological rules in English remind me of social rules that we have? I think about this a lot. Therefore, is there a link between how language works and how society works? Okay, my answer is yes, but then lots of questions come out of that. Is there a relationship between the complexity of the sentence structures and the complexity of the idea? I think that that's a good question to answer too. So I'm not asking you, or even I'm not expecting you to choose any of these. I'm just giving you some samples of what theoretical questions about linguistics can look like. So notice a lot of them focus on relationships between people and concepts, or between models of looking at language and models of looking at people. Those types of things are interesting to me. I'd like you to choose something that's genuinely interesting to you. If you write about it well, I assure you I will be interested. Okay, thank you very much. Let me know if you have questions.